This is not a shuttlecraft from Star Trek. It is the Hyundai Staria Hybrid. While I was down here in South Korea for something completely different, I couldn't resist asking Hyundai to let me get my hands on their quirky, futuristically shaped minivan. Not just because of the hybrid model, but because of all the different kinds of Starias that you can get. Rather sadly, I was not able to get my hands on the one that I wanted, which is the factory camper van. That is absolutely fantastic, and we're certainly going to talk about it in this video, but here's what it looks like. You can also get a high top from the factory and one that has 4 rows of seats. Yes, there is an 11-seat minivan from Hyundai, and there's also a luxury limo minivan if you want something a bit more opulent. But the reason I was interested in the Staria actually has everything to do with that camper van and tangentially the cargo van. Two areas in the United States where we don't see much competition. There really is no cargo minivan on sale in the United States from the mainline car companies. You can, of course, get some Mercedes Metris cargo vans, but this would be interesting because it is considerably bigger than the average American minivan. Let's take a look. One of the most interesting things about the Staria is that as futuristic as it is on the outside, the inside is actually a bit of a blast from Hyundai's past, because this is styled a bit more like Hyundai's previous generation product line than their current product line on the inside, but on the outside, it's decidedly futuristic. Let's talk about that first. You'll notice that this is not as blunt-nosed as previous Hyundai minivans, and that means that this is much more likely to comply with crash regulations all around the world. This doesn't have that Vanagon style, very blunt front end where the driver's sitting practically on top of the front wheels. Instead, we have something that kind of reminds me of the Volkswagen ID Buzz, where we have this really egg-shaped front end that's trying to give you the illusion of a very flat front. Headlights, those are LEDs, and they're really low on the front bumper. The turn signals, they're right in there. You just heard the hybrid engine turn on. The heater is running because it's 20 degrees out here. We have the big LED light bar running right across the front, and of course that big Hyundai logo as well. Now, size-wise, this is just over 206 inches long, so this is actually a little bit longer than most minivans in the United States, but importantly, it's about 10 inches taller, and that's why the proportions look so unusual. The tall roofline means that the inside experience is more van than minivan in the United States, and maybe that's the best way to think of the Staria, is as a small van, not a minivan, because this really defies the normal minivan styling and feature set convention that we find in the US. You'll notice that step-in height is a bit higher than the average minivan, and the seats are higher off the ground as well. It's really noticeable if you look in the front, for instance, here, where we have kind of a step and then a step up into the van. That's also due to the fact that this is available with all-wheel drives. There has to be a way to get power to the rear wheels, although this particular model is front-wheel drive. Let's move around to the back here, where we find a very different and distinctive design with a rear end that just sort of looks like, I don't know, the sausage was just sort of chopped off right at the end. It's a very, very blunt rear end. They have a bit of aero style to these huge tail lights. You can see they actually kind of curve around a little bit in that area. When you look closely, you'll notice the taillights have a nod to the pixel theme that we find in other Hyundai vehicles, although in this Staria, these are 100% incandescent modules. Back here, if we open this hatch, it is a powered hatch, if it ever opened. Apparently it took me a while to find the right button back there, but here's what things look like when that hatch is open. We have a very tall cargo area, significantly taller than the average minivan in the US, and the hatch is really huge. It opens very tall. We have the shoulder belts for the third row way back here. That's kind of an unusual spot for them, if I'm honest, but I think that has to do with the way that the fourth row of seats would integrate into the back if this model had them. The other rows would move around a little bit, and then we would get a fourth row of seats right back here in the rear. You get 3 seats in the back and then 2 seats in every other row in that particular model. Of course, there are a ton of different seating arrangements in the Staria. We're just taking a look at one of them today. But the big thing to know is that these are more traditional van-like seats. You can see they're on rails there. There's a handle to help you remove it and a lever here, so that way you can drop the seats down and fold them forward. Moving back outside, the hybrid model we're looking at today has 235/55 R18 tires on 18-inch wheels. They do look on the small side, especially given the general dimensions of the Staria. Now let's talk about what's going on under the hood. Depending on where you're shopping for your Staria, there may be 3 different drivetrains available, including a turbo diesel, a V6 engine, or this 1.6-liter turbocharged hybrid. Yep, 1.6 liters and a turbo and a hybrid system and a 6-speed automatic. If that sounds familiar, this is the exact same hybrid system essentially that we find in the Santa Fe, the Tucson, and of course the Kia Carnival minivan. In fact, that Carnival minivan is probably the closest corollary to this because we get about 245 horsepower out of this system and it's front-wheel drive only. Rather unusually, even though you can get all-wheel drive in the Staria diesel, it doesn't appear that you can get all-wheel drive in the Staria hybrid. At least I wasn't able to find any indication of that in any of the immediate information that we were able to find around the world. Obviously, this has not been EPA tested, but I suspect if it were, it would probably average around 32, maybe 33 miles per gallon. In our real-world driving out here in South Korea, even though it has been pretty cold, we've been averaging about 30 miles per gallon, which is pretty decent considering the general shape and the size of this. And speaking of size, we probably just ought to hop inside next. That way I can take off my beanie and maybe not freeze to death. This model is a 3-row Staria, so you can see that we have a 3rd row back there with 3 seats, and we then have a 2nd row with 3 seats with a twist. This is actually a single seat module, and then we have the 2-seat module that I'm sitting in here. Likely due to the desire for a big cargo area in the back, and of course the provision for the 4th row, we don't find as much legroom in the back as you might suspect, although we do have gobs and gobs of headroom. This 2nd row seat is slid all the way back in its tracks, and interestingly, the 2nd and 3rd rows slide. In addition, the seat bottom cushion for the 3rd row comes up. That's how you grab the handle to move the 3rd row forward and backward. Of course, if you move it any further forward, you're really not going to have a lot of legroom going on there. The 2nd row, as you can see again, is a split sort of 60-40 design. So we find 2 seats over there and then the 1 seat here, although they're about the same width. So it's more of a 30-30-30 or 33.3, 33.3, 33.3 for those math people out there. Speaking of that 2nd row, let's take a look at that now. I find this row to be a little bit more comfortable than the 3rd row, although they look very similar. Interestingly, this one has a different slide mechanism, but the seat bottom cushion does not flip up. We also have the panoramic moonroof right above our heads. It's interestingly positioned, kind of in the middle of this 2nd row, so you get a little bit of a view from the 3rd row, a little bit of view from here. We have air vents in the ceiling and controls for the HVAC. Right here, it's a 3-zone climate control system. And then, as I said, we have this 2nd row seat that slides and folds separately, which does make sense because otherwise getting back there into the 3rd row would be tricky, and this does allow 3rd row access a little bit more easily. This is only one of a ton of different seating configurations in the Staria. As I said, we have that 4-row model. There's also a version with throne-like 2nd row seats that have ottomans, and the camper one, which is the most interesting, where the 2nd and 3rd row fold flat into a bed, and then over here on this side of the cabin, we have a full kitchen. There's also an onboard water heater and a shower, so definitely a full-fledged camper. Then the roof pops up so that way you have a bit more headroom when you're camping. The windows in the back are definitely old school. These slide to the side. It's kind of a portal style window. When it's closed, it's flush with the outside. So it kind of comes in and then slides to the back. And then in the rear, we have those very classic 1980s minivan vent windows where only the back opens and it's hinged up there at the front. One of the other things we don't see in North America anymore is what's going on up front. We have a bench seat, but not a traditional bench seat. You notice the captain's chair over here is for the driver, and then we have a separation, and then we have a 2-person bench. The outboard seat feels kind of like a captain's chair, but if I lift up this center section where we have cup holders, storage cubbies, etc., you notice this little bar actually pops out of the passenger seat to latch that right in place. And then the shoulder belt comes out of the passenger seat. But then both passengers share a common seat bottom cushion. Here's a better look at the front so you can really see that bucket shape going on for the outboard seat. This is a really interesting way to do a bench seat, something that I wouldn't mind seeing in some other vehicles in North America. Moving up to the ceiling, you can see the 2-pane moonroof setup. This one actually opens up front, whereas that back one does not. We have the passenger view camera right there. Again, those HVAC controls, adjustable head restraints, and height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger. There are a bunch of different interior options. The model that I'm driving today has all hard plastics absolutely everywhere. So on the doors, no soft touch armrest or anything like that. You can get a soft touch panel kind of in that little curved area there, but this one is all hard plastic everywhere. Hyundai gives us a number of different ways to grab the door and a bunch of places to store your stuff there in those door panel storage cubbies. Moving over to the dashboard, the air vent theme kind of reminds me a little bit of the Hyundai Tucson, but lots of hard plastics. Everything is hard. And this glove compartment, that's kind of unusual because it's almost a vertical slot. You really just sort of stick things in there, kind of like a toaster. Moving up to the dashboard, we find one of two different screen setups. So here we have an approximately 10-inch touchscreen infotainment system. It's not running the current version of Hyundai's software. It's about one version behind. And then we have a partial LCD cluster right here instead of the full LCD that is available. This is a really eccentric design. Here's what it looks like from the passenger perspective, where we have this long, almost L-shaped hood over that display, and then these big storage cubbies up in the dashboard. There are a decent number of things that are missing here for an American audience. One cup holder over here for the driver, and that's about it, because if you have the passenger seat folded, that middle seat, then you don't get those two cup holders. There's nothing over there for that passenger. We have a USB port for plugging in your dash cam, definitely something that you find in a lot of world markets out there. And then going back down here, we do find phone projections, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Lots of touchscreen buttons, or touch buttons, I should say, for the climate control system. This has basically been borrowed out of some other Hyundai models as far as its design. There's a little readout there for who's buckled in the back. We have heated and ventilated seats up front. Qi wireless charging mat down there with that little Qi indication. The USB interface port here is for your smartphone integration. No wireless CarPlay in this model. We have kind of an awkward storage bin down there where I guess you could put some water bottles or juice boxes or things like that. We'll have a little storage cubby right there, kind of a traditional console shifter. And then on the driver's side, we find a steering wheel that is, as I said before, harkening back to kind of a different generation at Hyundai. No paddles on the back. We have our infotainment buttons over here on the left side, adaptive cruise control and lane centering over there on that side, and kind of this silver swoosh running through the middle of the steering wheel. The turn signal stalks, etc., those are also a generation behind, and we don't have that console shifter that we're seeing in so many new Hyundai models. Over here we have controls for the windows and the mirrors. We do have power folding side view mirrors, heated steering wheel, the 12-volt battery reset button that we find in other Hyundai models, and as you can see, again, just acres and acres of hard black plastic. By funny happenstance, before I flew to Korea to drive a bunch of things here, I actually had the Tucson hybrid at home, and that uses basically the same 1.6-liter turbocharged hybrid system, as does the Kia Carnival. Unlike the Tucson, and more like the Carnival, of course, this is front-wheel drive only. There's no all-wheel drive hybrid Staria. And that does strike me a little funny because you can get an all-wheel drive system in the Staria, just not with the hybrid system, at least for now. And that's something that I would love to see in this, because how cool would a Staria camper hybrid all-wheel drive vehicle be? I think that would be all kinds of fun. Obviously, the turbocharged diesel, which does have all-wheel drive, is going to have a bit more torque than we find out of this hybrid system at more usable RPMs, so maybe more suitable for outdoorsy adventure and camping, but the hybrid would give you better fuel efficiency. And maybe we should start there. This is obviously bigger, and it's a little bit heavier than the Carnival, and a lot blunter as far as the front end design goes. So fuel economy hasn't been as good. We've been averaging 29.5 miles per gallon. And that is American gallons, just in case anybody out there is interested. That is obviously better than any of the V6 minivans in North America, but not quite as good as a Chrysler Pacifica hybrid, although the Sienna hybrid is actually not that much better than this. It's only, maybe about 2-3 miles per gallon in real-world driving better than the model that I'm driving right here. I think that has to do with just the design of this hybrid system and the fact that the 6-speed automatic transmission can give you seemingly better fuel economy, especially at higher highway speeds than some of the other hybrid systems that we see out there. Also, of course, that last Sienna we tested was an all-wheel drive Sienna, and that is going to drop your fuel efficiency down just a little bit. Now, speaking of fuel efficiency, we should talk about the shape of this, because the shape of the Staria is decidedly unusual, especially for North America, although it is quite like the Volkswagen Buzz. Much like the Buzz, this has a really flat front end, but a modern 21st century crash structure. And that means that I'm not sitting right at the front of the vehicle like I would be in a Volkswagen Vanagon or something like that. Instead, I'm sitting decently behind the front wheels in more of a normal minivan style driving position, and then I have this really long dashboard and then that blunt drop in front of it. So you can see what's going on very easily in front of the vehicle, but we've got a lot of glass up front and the visibility changes around a bit. We have huge windows, so visibility is actually really, really good, but these tiny little A-pillar windows there, they're not doing a whole lot. In traffic though, this actually probably has better visibility than any other minivan in the US, especially due to these really low side windows and the really big side view mirrors. But back to the Staria and the numbers. This model ran 0 to 60 in 10.6 seconds. That's definitely not speedy by North American standards, but it's actually not that far off minivans of yesteryear in the US or the Kia Carnival hybrid. The hybrid Carnival actually surprised me in that it's a lot slower than the other minivans in the United States. Then we have something like the Toyota hybrid minivan, the Sienna. That's not exactly that swift either. And if you want a sports minivan, that's going to be something like the Honda Odyssey with the V6. That is actually pretty swift as far as 0 to 60 times. But unusually with this hybrid system, and different than the Toyota hybrid system, when the battery is depleted in the Staria, like the Carnival hybrid, we actually have more torque out of this engine thanks to the turbocharger. And that's definitely something you'll notice at higher altitudes or steeper grades or when the van is fully loaded, that when the battery pack has been depleted, this feels peppier than the Toyota minivan because the engine's simply producing more power and more torque. We also have the conventional 6-speed automatic transmission, so as we're driving along here, the transmission is definitely shifting. However, you will feel the extra weight versus something like the Carnival or of course the Tucson, because this spends a lot less time in electric-only operation than those other alternatives. In my quick 60 to 0 stopping test, it took 121 feet for this to stop, so actually pretty similar to most minivans in the US. Handling ability, that's a little bit different, and surprisingly so, because this does feel pretty decent out on some of the winding roads that I've been on here, but obviously it's heavier and top heavier than the other minivans. It's about 10 inches taller, and that's part of why it feels kind of like I'm driving a minibus rather than a minivan, because this is significantly higher than the average US minivan, and it just has a very different vibe to it. Yes, it has a passenger car steering wheel, but the rest of the vibe is a little bit more bus-like. The steering, that's car-like, the handling ability, somewhere between worlds, but the ride quality also is different than the average American minivan, because in South Korea they tend to like softer sprung suspensions, so this definitely has a more supple ride as far as soaking up potholes and expansion joints and just rough pavement, etc. This is more comfortable than the average minivan. The downside to that is that we have a little bit more body roll, a little bit more tip and dive, and you will notice that in the twisties that this starts to start wobbling around a little bit in a way that most minivans in the US don't. On the other hand, it is surprisingly quiet in here, including wind noise, which surprised me because of this really blunt front end. If you take a look at the exterior camera, that's actually on top of the roof just above me, quite far from the front of the vehicle, looking quite down on the front, and you can't really tell where the front of the vehicle is there just because of how blunt nosed this vehicle is. But even at 110 kilometers an hour, which is one of the faster speed limits that we've encountered here, we didn't really get much wind noise in the cabin. Now, bear in mind, we haven't been driving terribly swiftly here in Korea because there are a ton of speed cameras, as you can see there and everywhere all around us. Regular speed cameras, average speed cameras, traffic light cameras. There are a lot of cameras going on here to make sure that you're driving appropriately, which is probably why traffic seems to be quite calm in Korea. Long story short, this is not the most exciting thing I have ever driven, but it is one of the more interesting things. And I'm sad that Hyundai did not have the camper available for me to test or the high roof version, because you can get not just a pop top, you can get a factory high roof and a factory camper van. And those are the ones that I find really intriguing. If I were to shop for a family vehicle like this, personally, I would want something like the camper, because you could take the kids out on a camping adventure, you'd have a factory warranty for all the parts, and conversion vans back when I was a kid had none of that. They simply weren't that kind of camper van. You had parts falling off on the inside when they were only a few thousand miles old because the conversion company did it, things squeaked, things rattled, the pop-top roofs leaked, etc. A factory camper, a factory pop-top is a really novel thing that for some reason we see in plenty of world markets, but we just don't see in the United States. And there you have it. That's the futuristically funky hybrid Staria. I would love to see a hybrid camper model with all-wheel drive come to the United States. I don't really think there's much of a future for the rest of the Staria lineup. I think the cargo models would be really cool because we don't find much in the United States that's between a full-size van and a minivan in terms of cargo capacity and capability, and this has a really high roof. Low enough that you'll still be able to fit in most parking garages. It's not that high, but high enough that you get additional practicality versus a Pacifica, an Odyssey, or a Sienna, if you wanted to use one of those for cargo hauling. And then, of course, we have the epic camper van. That is what, for me, the Staria is all about. Because as I said before, we don't have factory camper vehicles from anybody else in the United States. There has been hope that maybe we'll get a Buzz camper at some point in time. But you know what? Hyundai could do that with a Staria because there's going to be a Staria electric at some point in the future. The size of the Staria, I think, is what makes this possible. Again, the roofline's already tall, but the body is also a little bit longer, and there's simply more room on the inside due to that really blunt front end design. And the fact that they've tried to push the passenger compartment as far forward as possible. That simply gives you more room on the inside to have that flip and fold seating arrangement where you have a bed, and then of course the more complete kitchen inside with a kitchen sink and refrigerator and things like that. I also love the small touches that Hyundai has made to that camper model, like external power ports that are mounted on the outside so you can power your campsite, the integrated hot water heater and shower, etc. They really have thought of quite a lot. And then importantly, there's the price tag on the camper version. Here in Korea, it's around $45,000 to $55,000, depending on options. There are a few things that might get you over that, but it is unquestionably more affordable than anything remotely like it in the United States. If you were to take a look at, one of those Sprinter conversions, yes, it's going to be bigger than this, not much bigger, but it is going to be bigger, but it's also going to have a price tag about double something along these lines. And it's a conversion. So you have to take it to Airstream for some of the Airstream stuff, Mercedes for the engine and transmission, etc. This would be a one-stop Hyundai shop because Hyundai is doing everything. And that's what's really intriguing about that model. It would be a unique, one-of-a-kind, affordable kind of RV, something that we have not seen in the US in quite some time. And I think that's why there's also been so much clamoring for Volkswagen to make some version of the ID Buzz like that. Are we ever going to see that world? I would say probably not, but you know what? We can always dream. Because I have to admit, if I were at my age going to go camping with my kids, I would probably want something like this. I think my tent camping days are over. I haven't tent camped in maybe about 10 years. I just don't see myself starting. But I could see myself taking kids somewhere in a camper van like this. Well, not like this, like the actual camper one, but you know what I mean. Now, if you want to know more about vehicles like this and all the rest of the things that I'm driving out here in Korea, hit that subscribe button down there. Stay tuned for our updated videos. You can also find us on the podcast, on your favorite podcasting platforms, the podcast on YouTube, the X's, the Twitters, the everything's out there. We're apparently on everything. You can also find us over at Patreon if you want to support this channel. And I love the folks that do on a regular basis. And you can join this channel as a YouTube member. Why we have both, I don't know. Apparently we're supposed to have everything. One thing we can't have at the moment though would be the camper Staria. See all of you later.